If the military parade in China on September 3 was intended to anger American President Donald Trump, then it worked 100%. The main news of the day on September 3 is as follows. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth said on Fox News that Trump has ordered the restoration of the United States Armed Forces in light of the alliance between Moscow and Beijing. This isn't just political noise, because at the same time, a massive military parade took place in Beijing with Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim Jong-un, where Trump publicly addressed Xi Jinping with the words, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un." While you are plotting a conspiracy against the United States, the Kremlin immediately pretended to be innocent, saying there is no conspiracy at all. And we really hope that Trump is just being ironic. We are not joining forces, not joining with the Chinese against America. But no matter what you call it, the picture is the same. The trio of dictators on the podium in Beijing, while in Washington, the order is to flex military muscles and restore deterrence. This is the outline of today's news. And it's obvious that Trump has decided to respond harshly to both the Chinese and the Russians. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is September 3rd on the calendar. And before we begin, I want to say that every day on this channel we release fresh new news and analytical segments where we break down the main news stories. So be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with all the news. So, what exactly does it mean to restore the United States Armed Forces according to the Pentagon under Donald Trump? Here, United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth puts it as directly as possible. Quote, "We will restore the fighting spirit of the nation, of the warrior, rebuild our armed forces, and bring back deterrence." Not because we are seeking conflict, we are not. And we have made that clear to China, Russia, and others. But by being prepared, we prevent war, he said already as the Minister of Defense. And this essentially is a new framework for the budget, staffing of the United States Armed Forces and procurement. In other speeches, Pete Hegseth's team emphasizes the same theme, that it is necessary to restore military ethics, bring back a sense of readiness, stop confusing the army with a laboratory for social experiments, and so on. In other words, this is rhetoric aimed at rapid recruitment, tough training, and a focus on long-range strike capabilities and unmanned RAI drones. This isn't just a paraphrase, it's the official language of the Pentagon during the Donald Trump era. Also, it's important to remember that at the start of Donald Trump's second term, Pete Hegseth made that statement. On the contrary, they will cut the military budget, they will reduce Pentagon funding, maybe they'll do something with the army because too much money is being spent. Overall, war isn't about Trump, he's actually for peace. And here Trump, against the backdrop of this military parade in Beijing, says, all right, then we are restoring the United States Armed Forces in America, investing money, and on the contrary, building up our army with weapons. Now the facts that stand behind this rhetoric. China has benefited most from improved relations with Russia and has rapidly built up its military in a way the United States cannot ignore for years. A direct dry point from the Pentagon report on the capabilities of the National Liberation Army of China. Quote, "The Pele Navy is numerically the largest in the world, with over 370 ships and submarines in its combat forces. By 2030, there will be about 435 such ships. Well, as you understand, these aren't just little ships. This is a real fleet. Frigates, destroyers, and submarines that overwhelm with their numbers in the western part of the Pacific Ocean. For comparison, the United States Navy currently has just under 300 combat ships, even though they are larger and more technologically advanced, but in terms of numbers, it's still less. The same Pentagon report notes a sharp increase in China's nuclear capabilities and a massive arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles designed specifically to deny United States forces access to China's coast. In other words, deterrence is needed not in general, but up close so that American aircraft carriers, bombers, and submarines can actually operate within the first and second island chains around China. The money for this doesn't come out of thin air either. The latest Stockholm International Peace Research Institute report reveals a proportion that explains United States nerves. American military spending is about $997 billion. This includes nuclear items, pension expenses for veterans, and so on. That is almost $1 trillion. China spends $314 billion and is growing faster than the global average. Even if you argue about the methodology, it's still obvious. Beijing is ramping up its military power rapidly and doing it together with a missile anti-access zone. Against this backdrop, the order to rebuild the United States Armed Forces is not a political performance, but a minimum budgetary and industrial plan. Let's add geopolitics to this. On the parade sidelines, Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim Jong-un showed mutual understanding, while Trump appeared irritated and sarcastic. Xi Jinping, in his speech, he put forward the formula peace or war, dialogue or confrontation. Well, in other words, it's a classic Chinese way of packaging a show of force. We want peace, but if not, we're ready for war. There's also the energy connection between Moscow and Beijing. The Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline has been approved, but it seems to be stalling over the price and so on. But China is ready to take additional volumes through the existing gas pipelines and the Far Eastern route. It's not much, but the political point is they've still increased their Russian gas purchases. It's not an alliance in the legal sense, but it's a systemic mutual benefit for China. Russia's discount and resources are like oxygen under sanctions, plus the supply of dual-use components to Washington. This is perceived as a growing two-step process, meaning the binding of Russia and China into a single alliance. That's why the United States Army's military restoration is being planned, emphasizing industry, the Navy, and long-range forces. Okay, but what if, as they say, the situation is war tomorrow? Well, let's go through the calculations here. The most realistic are the large-scale Center for Strategic and International Studies Wargames about Taiwan, meaning exercises and attempts to put together a picture of what would happen if there were a war there. Their straightforward conclusion sounds very uncinematic. The United States and its allies usually prevent the National Liberation Army of China from landing. But the price is hundreds of lost aircraft, dozens of lost ships, heavy losses for Japan, economic devastation for Taiwan, and China loses its amphibious fleet and tens of thousands of people. As you can see, this is not an easy victory or an inevitable defeat. It's a kind of mutual bloodletting where the key to victory is being prepared in advance. And being prepared in advance means stockpiling ammunition in the region, saturating the area with air and missile defenses, having geographically dispersed airfields, and deploying long-range anti-ship missiles on naval and air platforms. This means massive unmanned aerial vehicle raids. And attention! A political decision by Japan to allow combat operations from its territory. And this is exactly the list that is linked to restoring deterrence in the American way, which Pete Hexet is talking about today. Next, industry. Clicking heels at briefings doesn't do anything without hardware. Well, there's Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un as much as you want, but if they don't have backup, but it looks like they do have backup. And here there is a core. The Army's ammunition supply line is swelling to 6 figures a month. The plan for 2025 is to reach 100,000 shells. To support this, the capacity of the Scranton Company and related sites is being expanded. Long-range anti-ship missile procurement is being sped up. Missiles intended for bombers, ships, and coastal units. This is regarding the Americans. The United States Navy lags behind China in the number of hulls, but relies on quality, long range, and network effects. That is, it means there are many allies and locations. This is what they're trying to strengthen, from unmanned surface systems to strike drones launched from sea platforms. That is, orders about restoration turn into specifics. More steel, more gunpowder, more carriers, and more smart munitions. As for the scenarios of a future war between China and the United States, it's not just about Taiwan. There are also so-called gray scenarios, like a prolonged blockade of Taiwan with so-called inspections. This includes sabotage of underwater infrastructure, something the Russians have already tested in the Baltic Sea, as well as cyber attacks and jamming of navigation, where each country pretends it's not them at all. Again, this is what Russia is doing in the Baltic Sea. They damage cables and disrupt communication, but pretend it's not them. Beijing and Moscow are already operating in this gray zone. Europe witnessed this directly through its pilots' eyes. The European Commission chief's plane landed in Bulgaria using paper maps due to global positioning system jamming. And NATO has officially acknowledged spoofing and jamming. This is a lasting threat that must be addressed, like air defense gaps. For the United States, it's another argument. Allies stay home so they don't have to fight the fire barehanded. If allies maintain order in their skies, at sea, and in cybersecurity, Washington's cost for any fight decreases. Where is Ukraine in all this? Ukraine is right at the center. Moscow is tied to Beijing, and Beijing is focused on its strategic pause until 2027. What is meant is that until 2027 they are not entering into conflicts, but are preparing for an invasion of Taiwan, while Washington is working to restore deterrence both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific region at the same time. It's not either or, it's both and, meaning both Europe and the Indo-Pacific region. The harder the West puts pressure on Russian logistics, the less motivation Beijing has. Yes, he benefits from this. Now about the relationship. Here, Trump holds two opposing positions. He claims an excellent relationship with Xi Jinping, yet also says, we will impose the toughest trade and technological restrictions against China. This is a kind of tactical style. We speak softly but cut hard. In military terms, this translates into deterrence through readiness. And here we return again to Pete Hegseth's quote, we do not seek conflict, readiness prevents war. The meaning is simple. We greet Beijing, shake hands, but we keep our weapons ready in various forms, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and we tell our allies to finally take up their duty. Air defense involves warehouses, weapons production, domestic repair of weapons and equipment, and more. It's an unpleasant, expensive routine, but there's no such thing as a cheap peace in the real world anymore. This is a conclusion that needs to be said out loud here. The parade in Beijing showed a picture of three dictators on the podium who are clearly acting together. Well, Trump's order to restore the armed forces is a response with money and iron. This isn't about wanting, it's about lacking an ammunition industry, long-range missiles, and network effects. Any red line, well, it's just a melody drawn on water, meaning it doesn't mean anything. The United States is basically fixing three things at the same time right now: the army, the industry, and the alliance architecture. This applies to both Europe and Asia. China and Russia will keep testing this new structure. Sometimes with a military parade, sometimes with these threats. What's going on there? Fico and Orban in Europe can cut off gas and electricity to Ukraine by jamming navigation, sabotage, diversions, and so on. So, a reality check is very simple. How quickly will the Pentagon turn Hegseth's words into supplies and combat readiness, and the Allies into closed gaps in their own home defense? If the speed is high, the war will remain just in those very war games. If not, then the war game will simply become the plan for a new war that dictators will lay out before themselves. On the table, here I'll put an ellipsis. Write your opinion and your conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so by donating through the links and details in the description of this video or by using the QR code on your screen. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.